All right. Thank you for joining us, everyone. I'm Daniel, and today joining me is a very special guest. He is the Professional Bowlers Association, or PBA, Director of Rules and Equipment, Neil Stremmel. Neil has an incredible background in engineering and has worked with several major governing bodies in bowling in the United States. And he also has decades of bowling experience and a front row seat to many incredible advancements of equipment in the bowling industry. And Neil, I'll let you talk a little bit more about this, but his current role with the PBA is crucial to the fairness and legality of equipment for the players that compete for a living every week. So, welcome, Neil.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, real quick, if you could just describe your background in bowling.
Yeah, so my parents owned a center when I was a kid. So I started bowling very young. I started working there as a teenager and spent a lot of time growing up at at the bowling alley that we called it at the time. And but from there I went to college. I got a mechanical engineering degree and I actually worked in aerospace on some cool jet aircraft. I worked in nuclear power for 10 years. Um, but then, yeah, right around 99, 2000, I went to ABC, started working for the American Bowling Congress and the Women's International Bowling Congress here in Wisconsin. And then it became USBC. We moved to Texas. I moved to Texas as well. I started out in um, equipment specs and moved up to, managing director where I had coaching and Team USA and rules and equipment specs. And then eventually, I left USBC. I went into acoustics. There's another, nonprofit organization, spent some time there, but, came back to bowling. I worked at Kegel for a while. I managed Cypress Lanes down in Florida for a few years and then came back up to Wisconsin shortly as the Bowling Centers Association of Wisconsin, their executive director. So that's kind of a BPAA of Wisconsin. So there's another link, and then came on with the PBA after that. I also spent time, working with World Bowling, while I was at USBC and even beyond that. So, anyways, you said short and quick. Sorry, was not short and quick, but
That's
that kind of
okay.
covers it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have an enormous background in bowling, which is great because that leads right into my next question of how has your experience with those companies, the ABC, the WIBC, USBC, and now the PBA, like how has all of that culminated to help you in your current role with the Professional Bowlers Association?
Yeah, well, that history really just, feeds right into it. So, I spent a lot of time in testing, equipment testing, setting up tests and setting up specifications, and as well as overseeing rules, and even, Team USA and coaching. So I worked with a lot of the elite level bowlers. I'm not an elite level coach, but, I worked with coaching. So I've seen that whole process. And I was in charge of getting the ITRC, the International Training and Research Center, built. And so that's where we, you know, test USBC tests all the equipment for, bowling as a sport worldwide. And so now from a PBA standpoint, I'm in charge of that as well. So
Yeah, and that's crucial to I think your role there. And it sounds like your background has tremendously helped you through this in this role because now you took over the position of Director of Rules and Equipment with the PBA. And we've seen quite a few changes over the years as well in your history in bowling. And that brings us to what today's main topic is, and that is how has bowling changed over time? So, if we were to take a look back throughout, let's say, the last 30 years, bowling's dramatically changed. And I think you would definitely agree with that. So, it not only includes the technology, yeah, a little bit, it not only includes the technology that they have used to create the bowling balls, but the oil, the way the oil is applied to the lanes, the way the bowlers deliver the bowling ball, and even the lane surface and the bowling pins nowadays, too. So even if we turn back all the way through time back to the 90s, whenever something that came out that changed bowling forever, which was reactive resin. And the first ever ball, I believe, anyways, to come out that had this technology was the New Line Excalibur. So, from your perspective, Neil, how did how much of an impact did reactive resin coming out have on the bowling industry?
Yeah, you could say that had a beginning of, some a technical revolution. There were a lot of different, following that, there were a lot of different covers, led to particle balls. So there's been, an evolution, with the ball. The cores themselves have gotten much more advanced and technical, and our understanding of them and their influence and impact on the lanes has really grown over the past, 30 years. And that you could say that was really, a big step where it's like, okay, chemistry or just technological advancements can have a huge impact on the game. And that's when people maybe open their eyes and like, wow, this is really different. And made people start looking at it a different way. It opened up a new box, Pandora's box of like, oh, what else can we do? And people started, researching and testing and trying to understand better what can impact, ball motion and the sport of bowling in general.
Absolutely. And that impact had such a substantial drive in the way bowling is today, even 25 to 30 years later now. And so since the performance of reactive resin is so different than the previous bowling balls, which were urethane, plastic, rubber, um, since it's so different than urethane, in your opinion, because you have the chance to see the professional bowlers out there pretty much every week and you're involved in their equipment that they use. So, why do so many of them still choose to throw urethane these days at the professional level?
Yeah, so obviously urethane has made a big comeback. Really, today's urethane is not, yesterday's urethane. So there's some evolution there as well, but obviously the ball motion is fairly similar, and it's really, it's another tool in their bag. And um, when the patterns get, so difficult, or you're moving pair to pair to pair, and you don't know what you're going to run into on that next pair, having something that doesn't overreact, like a lot of reactive resin balls, having something that's a little more controllable, understandable, simpler, etc., like today's urethane, that becomes something that, has a benefit to maintain some higher scores. If you're moving pair to pair and you lose track of what's going on, you lose a couple of frames right away. Well, you can't give up, 20 to 40 pins in the first two frames at the professional level. So this allows them to kind of hang on to, you know, minimal changes and be able to dial in much quicker. Now, sometimes the scoring pace is like, I can't, stick with urethane. I can't be in urethane. I've got to be aggressive and I've got to make those choices. And so, it depends on a lot of factors, but sometimes it's a good choice for them. And sometimes, it's not going to be a good choice. They're not going to be able to keep up. Um, and then there's, the hybrid where a lot of times, especially in the right length patterns, they'll start with it, but then eventually realize, okay, at some point I gotta have to move in and then switch at that point. So there's a lot going on, and today's urethane is uh, just more like a little closer maybe to reactive than the old urethane. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So one thing I want to point out that you did say is, yeah, there's a difference in how urethane used to be versus how it is today. So what is the biggest difference that you see between how urethane is today versus how it used to be?
yeah, I could get into the chemistry, and there's even, plenty of the chemistry that I don't know. They don't want to share that with me. I completely understand that. And I'm not a chemist.
Hmm.
So that, there's been some changes, some evolution to that. And just today's urethane, it still reads early and wants to start up earlier than the resin, but it has more reaction to it, more hook to it, more finish, continuation on the end is really, the key differences. And so I think that allows the pros and other top bowlers and whatever, top events they're in, it allows them to do that as well and still have enough of a entry angle and reaction that it works for them, while still kind of maintaining that consistency and not dealing with quite so much change every game.
Sure, absolutely. So my next question is, as bowling has progressed over the years, we've seen these huge research and development advancements and how it's dramatically progressed over time. And even like recently, we've seen Storm and even Motive are diving into like the oil absorption rates of the bowling balls and the differences that it can have on the reaction of the bowling balls. So in your opinion, Neil, what is the impact that the new technological developments have had on professional bowling?
Yeah, there's been a lot of changes, like we said, and those changes will, impact, league bowling, but it's going to impact, professional bowling at just so much more. If you give some of the pros, they're the top 0.1% of bowlers in the world, you give them a half a board, they're going to take advantage of it. So you have to realize that like that's all they really need. And, in the league environment, maybe it just doesn't feel quite the same because, you get five boards, you get an arrow to
Yeah.
kind of play around with. And, as long as you can hit that, you're going to find yourself close to the pocket. Well, if you miss that much on the professional level, you have no chance. And so they're just so attuned, so consistent, so accurate, and practiced. Half a board is more than enough for them, even if it's right on the gutter or somewhere in the middle of play. They're going to find that, they're going to figure it out, and then they're going to, take advantage of that, open that up, and make as much out of it as possible. So when you think of all the changes, it did have, a large impact on league bowling, but it had, I think just even a bigger impact on the PBA. From a league bowling standpoint, you see that impact through honor scores and stuff that have just increased over the years in the past 30 years. On the professional level, you can see that, the pattern and what's used on the lane to protect the lane and kind of direct the scoring, that has an impact, but honestly only for a very short period of time. Once they find that place or find where they want to attack it, open it up, and it becomes more the lane surface and the topography. A lot of lanes, if they have consistent topography throughout the center, like that's going to be a good scoring event. And it's when there's just a lot of weirdness or inconsistency is that you start to see tougher scoring and confusion and problems and trying to understand what's going on. And that's true for the pros as well as the league bowlers. So there's been a lot of changes.
No, absolutely. And I like that you spoke to how much more of an effect that it has on the professional bowlers as compared to just your league bowlers, right? Because the professionals are out there day in and day out doing this for a living, right? That's why they're called professionals. And so I absolutely agree with that. I think that you definitely well said. And so there's one other facet that's been quickly evolving in bowling over the last few years. And we've seen recent popularity with it in the installation and use of string pin machines and pin setters across the US. In fact, here in Jacksonville, where I live, we have two bowling centers that have string pins in them. And the PBA has also started to experiment with such machines in the professional tournaments, and they've hosted a few events with them thus far. So, Neil, what correlation, if any, have you seen between the changes in the lane surface and bowling pins, pin setter machines over the years?
Yeah. So if you look at string pin, it's a whole evolution, very controversial.
Yeah.
USBC, did some scoring tests and came to their conclusions. Honestly, from a PBA standpoint, it's actually easier. When we're going to be bowling on it, it's not so much scoring because that can be manipulated, with the pattern. And so it's really more about, fairness and equity. And so since in a PBA event, we're having the event in the center, everybody's bowling in the same place, same environment, same lane surface, topography, and then of course pins and pin setter. So it makes it easier to hold a fair event and be able to evaluate it from that standpoint. But those like that change, you know, one of the main reasons that's coming about, as most of everybody out there probably knows, you have the mechanics are an aging group and they're retiring and they're no longer in bowling. They're harder to get a hold of. If you have a 12 or a 16 lane center, because of that, mechanics, the salary of mechanics have gone up, and just having a 12 or a 16 lane center, makes it hard to pay that price
Yeah.
and still stay open and what have you. So either you bite the bullet and you do that, or you don't have one. And a lot of times, proprietor of a smaller center, he or she end up being the mechanic, and that really wears on you. That can attest to that back from when my parents had a center when I was a kid. That's what we did, and yeah, that just wears on you over time. And so string pins, just far less maintenance required. A mechanic's really not required, and it would allow those smaller centers to stay open and service the bowler. So I see it from both points of view. I understand both perspectives, but I also think back 30 years ago, like we were talking, when I was at USBC approximately 30 years ago. Trying to remember, I think the amount of wood lanes to synthetic lanes, it was like 70% were still wood and only 30% were synthetic. And that's about 30 years ago. And now it's more than past that. It's the other way around. Like it's probably 80%,
Hmm.
maybe even 90% are synthetic. And it's only some of the smaller centers, that are still wood. And had we not had the foresight to yeah, let's move forward with synthetics, and ABC, WIBC approved it in the 80s, actually. I just can't imagine where we would be today. I mean, how many new centers would we be building if we had to still make them out of wood? Like it just really
Right.
would rarely be happening, not to mention how many centers would have had to have closed if they still had to be wood. And so I almost wonder if that's going to be how we look at string pins, 30 years from now. Like if we didn't allow string pins, where would the bowling industry be? So while I understand both sides, I've been in bowling a long time and I consider myself a purist in many, many ways. Um, but I also understand, the history. If we hadn't allowed synthetic lanes way back when, I just can't imagine where we'd be today. And yeah, pins is another scenario. Actually, the first synthetic pins were made in the 60s. They were the Magna pins. They had magnesium.
Ah.
They had a
Ooh.
magnesium shell. They had plastic over that magnesium shell, and then kind of they were foam inside. And so the Magna pin, was the first synthetic pin that had been approved by ABC back in early 60s. They were around for quite some time, and then twisters and other plastic pins have been approved in the past 30 years, and not as widely accepted, but definitely more durable. So similar to synthetic lanes, and the wood lanes have needed to move out. I guess luckily from a wood pin standpoint, we're still able to make wood pins, and so that gives the proprietors and the bowlers options as far as what kind of pins they bowl on. But hopefully we'll still have that option between string pins and regular free fall machines, and hopefully we'll still be somewhere looking at it that way 20, 30 years from now. But I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I actually didn't know that about the magnesium in the pin. That's
Magna pin.
interesting. Yeah, the Magnum, sorry. Yeah, that is interesting. So my next question is, so then what do you see as the biggest advantages and disadvantages of string pins? We'll start with the professional level and then we'll talk about the amateur level after.
Yeah, I think I kind of touched on it. Over the professional level, the advantage is, we're in one environment, and so it can be a consistent and fair environment for us to compete on and have an event. So I think that's, from a professional level, that's one advantage. The other overall advantage is, like we said, just being able to have centers open, um, having the mechanics not really be required. You can fix these machines much quicker and easier, and not have to have a specific mechanic that's been trained at such a level, and there just aren't as many of them out there.
Right.
And so those are the big advantages. Without that advantage, I don't think we'd be talking very much about them right now.
Absolutely. So, are there any disadvantages that you see at the professional level for them?
Well, at a professional level, I mean, the thing that stands out to people that they don't seem to like is, some of the pin actions. You see the pin action and maybe you see the pin fall, but it never got hit by another pin. It's up above a string or something is pulling that down. And through all the scoring, even with that advantage, there still is a decrease in the percentage of strikes. I did a report on it last year, looking at three different tests that we did. USBC had some similar results as far as the amount of strikes per game or the reduction of strikes, somewhere in the 7 to 9% reduction of strikes. So even though maybe pins fall down easier, they're really just harder to knock down overall. And so when you start to look at it from a holistic perspective, a statistical perspective, it kind of averages out more. Again, from a PBA perspective, we can change the pattern to affect scoring, and so in one environment we're just not as concerned. It's kind of fair for everybody, and you see those kind of things on free fall as well. Marshall Kent had a strike on TV where he didn't even hit the head pin. We've all seen that. We've all done it.
Yep.
It just happens, and so it's just similar but different. So that's kind of how we get there. So it can be looked at as a disadvantage. It's a disadvantage because PR wise, people just want to latch onto that and say, this is a problem. And again, as a purist, I get it. Like it's different, and we've been doing it a certain way for 100 and some odd years, and but here we are. If we want to move forward, if we want to have an open mind, if we want to think about the future and where we're going to be 30 years from now, let's take some of the history and realize, we'd be in a bad position had we not done something that we did 30, 40 years ago. And we just have to realize that, it's maybe not a positive PR decision today, but 30 years, I'm thinking that'll be, a logical, positive thing that we did. Back with the synthetic lanes, I remember people saying, I'm never going to be bowling on plastic lanes. And notice I went to my old man's voice. I'm an old man now, but because that was the attitude then. Oh, I'll never bowl on those plastic lanes. They're no good, and etc. And I remember hearing that, and you don't hear anything like that nowadays, and nobody really stops to think about where would we be had we not done that. So that's part of my job. I have to be open minded. I have to try to look at it from what's good for bowling long term, not just short term. That's just part of it.
Yeah, and something you said there too that it made me think of, maybe even 40 or 50 years ago, a purist back then probably would have said that pin setters aren't machines, but they're people, right? Because way back in the day,
Yeah.
they didn't have the machines to set the pins; they used to use people. So that made me think of that too, because I hadn't thought about it that way. So I think that's a very good perspective.
Yeah. If you want to hear another thought process that I had, people, again, another big evolution over the past 30 years that we haven't talked about. One is coaching. Coaching has gotten so much better. I've seen that evolution. I ran Team USA trials for many years, and I was able to see year after year after year just how much better the bowlers got. It was just really due to coaching. And then the other thing is the evolution of two-handers. We do hear some comments about, you know, one-handers versus two-handers, etc. But if you look at those old pictures, so something you said made me think of that. They have like lawn bowling. They'll have pins set up, and they're standing on it's just a drawing, somebody's painting from 100 years ago. And they have the pins on the lawn. There's no gutters, there's no lane, but they have a line drawn, and there's a guy standing there, with a wood ball in his hand. Doesn't look much bigger than, doesn't look like the size of a ball. But anyways, it's lawn bowling, and there's a line, and you stand behind the line and you throw it. And in those pictures, it looks like somebody's just standing behind the line. And at some point, I'm sure over the past 5,000 years, that was how it was. And at some point, somebody ran up to that line and threw the ball and threw it so much faster than anybody had ever thrown it before And somebody probably said, "Oh, you can't do that." Well, I stayed behind the line. There's no rule that says I can't run up to the line. And honestly, it's the same kind of thing whether you run up to the line with one hand on the ball or two hands on the ball. It's about staying behind the line, being consistent and being the best bowler in some form, fit, or fashion. And again, I'm sure that evolution happened between standing at the line and running to the line, and then one-handed and two-handed. You can go on with some of these big evolutions, and I do think the two-handed evolution has made it more exciting for a lot of the kids. We got more, youth bowling. I had tournaments here when I was the head of BCAW where we had high school and middle school, even middle school tournaments, and just the amount of kids, we see it collegiately a lot. They're just very exciting events. They're very exciting tournaments. They are attended very well. You have parents and other kids and what have you at these events screaming and yelling. They're a lot of fun. And I think that youth movement has been helped by, two-handed bowling. So I think that's a change that's helping us and will continue to help us into the future. So it's tough. Sometimes you want to be a purist, but other times you just have to realize for the betterment of bowling, evolution is going to be helpful.
Absolutely. And we even have examples of professional bowlers that are changing from one-handed to two-handed now with Darren Tang
Yep.
making the switch. And it's just incredible to see, even at the highest level in bowling that there is, to see somebody that is making a transition to try and get better on one side rather than the other. And it's just very interesting to see the way that bowling has progressed through that. With that said, is there anything else that you wanted to add today, Mr. Neal?
Well, I appreciate your time. We could probably spend a show on probably each one of those topics. We barely touched on coaching, two-handed bowling,
Yeah.
um, synthetic lanes, synthetic pins, pin setters. But anyways, I'm happy to talk about this and just kind of put a cap on like the changes over the past 30 years, and we're just going to continue to see more and more evolution. We just need to make sure things from a PBA perspective remain, fair and consistent, moving forward.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you joining me today, Neil. And it's been an honor of you to interview you and take a deep dive into the bowling industry, the way it's changed over time. And again, your role is crucial to professional bowling. And I'm confident that those who compete at any level of bowling are very grateful for the work that you do and your position in the PBA.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And I wish you the best, Neil. Have a great rest of the PBA season out there. We're coming up on the World Series of Bowling. Is that right?
Yep, starting pretty soon in Reno, Nevada for better part of a month there.
Have fun out there and best of luck with keeping the players cool and collected and holding them accountable on the PBA tour, right? Enforcing those rules.
But you got to do.
Yes, sir. So thank you again for joining me, and thank you everyone for watching today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Be sure to subscribe below and leave a like, and there'll also be a link to Neil's channel with the work he's done with the PBA in the description below for you. So thanks again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.